Dead Rising 2 Off the Record is, for lack of a better word, remarkable. It has plenty of flaws, but the fact that it exists at all brings me immense joy. If you're unaware, this is a non-canonical reimagining of the events of Dead Rising 2. That's one of only 2 times you'll hear me talking about the Dead Rising canon, as I really couldn't care less about it. Capcom Vancouver was already planning on a director's cut of Dead Rising 2, but the reception from their fans about Chuck Green as the new protagonist apparently caused them to modify their plans to produce what we have today. Off the Record is a what-if scenario of how things would play out if Frank West was at the epicenter of the Fortune City outbreak. The story is altered in interesting ways, there are new psychopaths to fight, plenty of new weapons to play with, and an entirely new area. There are plenty of minor changes as well. Boss fights are more difficult, zombies feel harder to manage, there are new survivors to rescue, and Zombrex and other secrets are now found in different locations. I'll get to those alterations in more detail in a minute, but basically what all this boils down to is you get to play Dead Rising 2 for the first time again. I really wish more studios would capitalize on how truly enjoyable going in a second time with specific differences can be. Capcom is among the only few that implement this type of thing with their games. Resident Evil commonly had 2 characters to play as, which would vary things up, in addition to different scenarios to pick from, which would move key items and weapons around, and a few other surprises. Nintendo dabbled with a second quest with the original Zelda game, as well as Master Quest for Ocarina of Time, which, apart from making dungeons a bit more challenging, had some interesting cosmetic differences. These types of reimaginings almost provide a new sensation when playing for the first time. You bring a lot of knowledge of the systems and story in with you, which means what the developers choose to keep the same or change can catch you by surprise. Perhaps a more similar comparison to Off the Record would be the Resident Evil remake. Besides being a perfect modern-day introduction to the series, it's just as enjoyable, if not more, if you're a returning veteran. If you played the original already, there's 1 or 2 specific gameplay twists that play on returning players' expectations. Going in, I thought this was going to be a slog to get through. I initially didn't want to play or do a video on this game, but sure enough, by the end of it, I was not only happy to spend another 25 hours in Fortune City, but grateful. This was more than just a director's cut of a great game, it was a fond farewell. To understand what I mean with that last line, you'll have to pull up a chair and sit through my monologue about Dead Rising 2 Off the Record. Oh yeah, I should mention the obvious, if you haven't watched my critique on Dead Rising 2, go do that before watching this. I went very in-depth with that game already, so I'll mostly be discussing the changes that were made for Off the Record. Before I get to those, however, I want to disparage Capcom for a bit for their pretty shoddy PC ports. If you're wondering why there was such a big gap between my Dead Rising 1 and Dead Rising 2 videos, it came down to trying to get the sequel working in the first place. I gave it a go with keyboard and mouse, but it felt awful, and for some reason it refused to recognize my Xbox One controller. I tried quite a few fixes, but never got anything to work, so I resorted after a while on purchasing a wired Xbox 360 controller, which ended up being what I had to use to play both the sequel and Off the Record. The dead zones are truly terrible, and I can't tell if this is the fault of the game itself or the controller, but navigating parts of the map to see where buildings were was a nightmare, as was shooting at enemies far away. I generally had to resort to strafing back and forth to get the targeting land in the right spots. The original game had a lot of crashing take place as well, which is pretty well known in the community, so much so that the biggest piece of advice you'll receive is to save every chance you get. Off the record, I didn't have any crashes, but I did experience a few glitches, whether it was relatively minor, such as a visual problem, or more serious ones like not being able to walk forward, as if I was constantly walking into a wall. At one point this happened during the Slappy fight, which made it much more difficult than it had to be. There was also this kind of humorous one with Chad. I wanted to get a picture of his reunion with Doris, but every time I pulled out the camera, he began strafing for eternity, unable to continue shooting zombies until I put the camera away. Maybe all of this should be expected, and the relatively smooth experience of the first Dead Rising port is the exception. Frank's return allowed Capcom Vancouver to seamlessly bring back a fan-favorite mechanic with him. He of course has his camera, which you can use whenever you like to take pictures. This also means the PP stickers are plastered everywhere as well. Providing another avenue for players to level up is a smart decision, especially given the fact that a lot of players will have already finished the original game, so going back to level 1 might feel discouraging. The experience you get from pictures isn't going to significantly quicken the level up process, but any little amount helps. The first story mission has you using the camera, just like the original Dead Rising, but beyond that, it's kind of a bummer it isn't required for more areas of the game. There's also a snapshot feature, which I'm assuming is the stand-in word for selfie, where you take a picture of yourself with a zombie. I thought I would roll my eyes at this, but when I took my first snapshot, I have to admit it did make me laugh. Because the camera is back, the genres are back as well, including erotica. If I haven't convinced you enough in the previous 2 videos that these games are sexist, let me try one last time. Obviously, if you take a picture of boobs, you get the erotica genre. I think that's fine, I understand it, but if you take a picture of a male zombie eating some dude's ass, that's apparently not erotica? I'm sorry, but that can't possibly be correct. All of the sexism nonsense would be so easy to fix, and that's what annoys me the most about it. In the cutscenes, have a few less camera shots staring directly at Rebecca's ass, and a few more staring at some dude's dong. With the zombies, allow the male survivors to eat your dick. Perhaps some aspect of the zombification process causes some primal hunger for genitalia, who knows. Have male survivors trigger the erotica genre as well, including male zombies eating assholes. There you go, the game is now far more inclusive with those few changes. It isn't the fact that it presents sexually suggestive scenes that don't pertain to the plot or theme in any way, it's that it's so one-sided. All it would take is the addition of male sexualization for it to be equal. I would never say Frank West was charming or anything, but even though the first game was released 4 years before its sequel, not much ground was gained in that time to develop a more charismatic and interesting protagonist. The voice actor for Chuck Green seems pretty cool though, taking the time to talk with people in the Dead Rising subreddit even, but I have to admit I didn't find Chuck to be a very interesting character in the original. I don't think Frank is ever someone I rooted for, and I remember calling him an asshole in the first video, but his lines always came off as fairly natural, and they do in this game as well. They seem to have doubled down and improved on his wit, as he now comments in real time about certain situations.
You sure you were just tanning in there?
A few of them got a laugh out of me, especially him lampshading the reuse of the vents, which is something I even pointed out in the previous video.
What is it with me and vents?
What's interesting is that they included a few lines of dialogue he could say.
Nobody ever thinks of the vents.
This surprised me a lot. I praised the games for including multiple endings to satisfy repeat playthroughs in the previous video, and this is the same sort of thing. They know their fanbase would most likely play the story mode at least twice through to get to level 50 and see different endings, so switching up some of Frank's comments was a nice consideration. Frank has most of his fighting skills back, which means somersault kicks and lariats are back on the menu. This is good since the zombies seem to hit harder anyway, so being able to fend them off barehanded after a while is a relief. Your lariat is as strong as ever and is what I use exclusively to destroy the drills. The zombie hop is the replacement to the zombie ride, and it's kind of strange. I've never seen Frank more athletic than when he leaps a dozen feet from one set of zombie shoulders to another. Speaking of skills, Off the Record has added plenty of new weapons to use and combo cards to unlock. I don't think many of them are incredible or anything, but some of them are pretty fun to use, and many of them fit the theme of the newly added space area. Alien probes and spaceships, along with alien masks even. The cryopod combines a fire extinguisher and a new item called the escape pod. Place it on a zombie's head and they take off, freezing every zombie underneath them. Another favorite of mine was the laser eyes. Alien head plus gems, and you get something that I never would have expected. It's actually fairly powerful as well. I kind of liked the lightning gun, where you combine a frequency gun with an electric prod. The electric prod is itself a new addition, and it's one of my favorites. Not because I like using it, but because the ending of Overtime mode originally had TK using one to stun Chuck. Now, instead of him magically acquiring one, you can see one in the hallway before the final fight, thus clearing up a massive plot hole that kept me up for weeks. The last combo card you unlock through leveling up Frank is a laser gun, which is like the Blitzkrieg but taken one step further. You need to create 2 different combo weapons, the laser sword and the lightning gun, then combine those 2 to craft it. It's alright, but it runs into the same issue as the Blitzkrieg did, where using it to gain experience makes no sense, as I'm already level 50. Speaking of the Blitzkrieg, they somehow made that so much worse. I'm very happy you unlock it early on, level 10 instead of level 50, but it's near unusable. This is what it looked like in the original. As you're watching this, I have to warn anyone who is prone to headaches for this next part, look away from the screen for a bit. Here is what it looks like in Off the Record. I have no idea how they could possibly mess up this badly, but here it is. Genuinely, when I watch it back even now, it nearly makes me nauseous. I checked the options and I didn't see anything for the screen shake, unfortunately, so I never used it again. In general, money is now much easier to acquire in Fortune City. I remember one time in the original I sniffed $1 million, but I was able to get that amount within the first playthrough relatively easily. I was able to afford both the key for the sports car in the Royal Flush Plaza and the SUV in the Strip without much of an issue. You could say I had plenty of money to burn. Slot machines have higher payouts, and the ATMs in addition to the slot machines drop more cash when hacked and destroyed. Where there were about 3 survivors who gave you money in the original, nearly every survivor offers you money when you save them in this version. They even added a lot of cash briefcases, which can house 10,000 to over 100,000. Apparently there were some of these briefcases in the original, but they didn't house this much cash and were much harder to spot. The most obvious change is the entirely new set of collectibles to hunt for in Fortune City. Security keys are scattered all over the map, giving you yet another reason to explore every nook and cranny. As you know, I love reasons to explore, so this was an absolute win. You take these to the bank found in the new area to unlock cash deposit boxes. The amount of money you can acquire from this ranges from about $10 to about 100,000, so it's fun opening them up to see what you get. These security boxes can also house Zombrex. This is the only downside of them, however. Half of the Zombrex that can be acquired via exploration and off the record are found in a few of these security bank boxes. After a while, it felt like I wasn't looking for Zombrex to survive, but security keys instead. It kind of took the enjoyment out of it, like the two weren't their own discoverable secret. Instead, a found key became a potential Zombrex dosage. I would have preferred the keys only house 1 Zombrex and the rest be other rewards. The cash was always nice, as was the inclusion of guns and magazines. The times you found gems were unfortunate, but it is something you might expect a person to put into a safe location, so in terms of believability, it made sense. The new area is Uranus Zone, and it's a really great addition. It's so distinct from what you normally see, it's a wonder how they didn't think of this for the original game. It's basically an amusement park with small carnival-esque games to play which earn you experience, a few rides, and the space theme is present throughout. It's a shame you can't actually partake in any of the rides though. The first game even had a spaceship ride you can hop on, so I don't know why that couldn't have been done here as well. There are 3 rides, but they're all functionally similar as they're just there to kill zombies. You lure them over and watch the kill count go up. The UFO crash is the only one that was worthwhile, since it was just so entertaining to watch the zombies go flying. An entirely new game mode was added, Sandbox mode. This apparently is what a lot of people wanted Dead Rising 1's Infinite mode to be, as many didn't enjoy the constant loss of health. There's no time limit, you can goof off killing zombies, psychopaths, and random hostile survivors for as long as you like. There are challenges scattered around the city as well. I haven't attempted even close to all of them, but from what I could tell there was a fair bit of variety here. All of them center around a time limit requiring you to do a task in that time, kill zombies, slice zombies, gain experience, race to a location, collect vibrators. The best part of all this is the introduction cutscene, to be honest. I just love the music that plays in the background when he jumps from the helicopter. It reminds me of Katamari Damacy.
It's my vacation!
For the general gameplay, there are so many changes, both good and bad, that I will lump all of them into this next section. First off, they definitely should have made Frank faster initially. I'm tired of making the same complaint over and over, but the starting speed is just too slow. It's bad enough that you begin at level 1 again, but having to suffer through this slow walking speed for the 3rd time is just deflating. The guide arrow, something I praised in the previous video, is absolutely terrible in this game, even worse than in the first Dead Rising. It never points in a general direction, instead it makes you walk in straight lines, seemingly in increments of 4 or 5 feet, then resets. This is easiest to see when driving around in a car. It flips out of control, not understanding where you are since your speed or general direction was never taken into account by the new system. If you follow it without question, you will be led astray at every turn. When transitioning between load screens with survivors, they added a new prompt that's very hard to miss at the top of the screen if they aren't with you. I don't think this was necessary, but it's not a big detraction either. The survivors are back to square one with their AI, it seems. I pointed out in the previous video specifically how I never had survivors die on me at all, that I could just walk and they would survive nearly every time. Well, I was shown immediately that this wasn't the case and off the record. I had to fight tooth and nail to get some of these survivors back to the safe house. I don't hate this alteration as much as the guide arrow though. I remember thinking it was a bit too easy in Dead Rising 2, so I guess I got what I asked for. I think the reason they die so quickly is how they modified the zombies' damage capabilities. In the original, once a survivor was grabbed, they wouldn't continuously take damage before being freed, but it seems here they do, which means if you spot a survivor being attacked, you better save them quickly. They added voice lines for Stacy when she calls you on your new earpiece.
I can see 2 construction workers trapped at the worksite in the South Plaza. Doesn't look good, you better hurry.
Even though on a surface level, one might jump to the conclusion that dialogue getting voiceover is a positive, I think it harms the overall experience in this case for quite a few reasons. You can't skip through the text on screen as she's talking out loud, so you need to wait for her to finish, which is a problem the sequel improved on its predecessor already. There are certain lines of dialogue that, when said out loud, really make it clear how ridiculous they were in the first place.
Got something?
It looks like someone's searching the shelves at Chris's Fine Foods in the Palisades. Maybe he's seen some Zombrex.
What makes Stacy think that this guy knows where to find Zombrex exactly? I understand the game is trying to hint at which side quests are the ones that offer Zombrex, but hearing this from Stacy, the character, is, well, I've already said it, ridiculous. The voice acting on these calls emphasizes the sometimes jarring pacing issues they have as well. During points in the game, Stacy will encourage you to help in a very important matter, then moments later she calls you about something much less serious. After calling you back to the safe room, signaling to us it's more serious than your average side quest, she shows you the video of a woman being dragged into a bathroom. Everything in the game paints this as a very important situation, yet a few seconds later she calls to inform you about 2 guys whom she isn't sure are laughing or crying.
I'm listening.
I see 2 guys in from Fortune with Love at the theme park. I'm not sure if they're laughing or fighting.
Undercutting the serious tone is par for the course for Dead Rising as a whole, but the fact that Stacy herself undercuts the tension that she created is laughable, and quite frankly makes her character less believable. The same kind of thing happens after you exit the safe room to take down the drills around Fortune City. Just have a listen and judge for yourself.
Spot anything?
Frank, there's a woman lying on the floor of the Venus Touch Spa in the Palisades. It looks like she's barely alive.
What's going on?
Those men have set up at the vaults in the Americana, the Slot Ranch Casino, and the Yucatan.
For the survivors themselves, a few new ones were added, some were removed, and plenty had their locations moved around. The paramedic that was in the bingo hall is now in a tunnel, the 2 jokesters that were in the sex shop are now in the Uranus zone, and the injured construction lady is now on the ground, which is a far better place for her, as with Chuck, getting her down from the scaffolding was awkward. By far the worst change of them all is the hungry guy who gives you Zombrex. Now, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief, but this is beyond egregious. He's apparently starving, just like the original, but instead of an empty restaurant, he's located in a fully stocked grocery store. Of course, the food here is inexplicably off limits when he's here, but if you come here any other time, you get infinite apples. This part pissed me off so much that I just killed him. A much smaller inconsistency that annoyed me was the hostage you can save after the chef fight. The reason you were supposed to find Jasper originally was because she didn't trust Chuck since he caused the outbreak. She knows Frank, trusts him, but wants him to find Jasper first anyway. I'm okay with this so far, but she again screams for help the moment you leave. Would it really have been that difficult to mute her cries for help this time around? The new survivors are fairly decent, 2 in particular are more interesting than the others. There's a karate kid who is in the underground tunnels being shot at by TK's leftover goons. She uses karate to fend off zombies, and even shows up in the zombie break-in chapter as well. There's also a dude who is hanging from the 2nd floor in the mall who needs you to place a stuffed bear underneath him so he can have a soft landing. It's a very small, and some might say worthless encounter, but I think this goes a long way, and I would have liked to see more. I have never used a stuffed elephant or bull or anything like that to do anything in the game, They for some reason can't be combined with the large machine gun like the giant teddy bear can, so their only use is to give as a gift to Katie in the original, or use it as a weapon in this version of the game. Having to place one in a specific spot so a survivor can land safely gives use to an otherwise worthless item. Probably the best quality of life change was the checkpoint system. Now if you die, you'll be loaded back to your last checkpoint instead of your last save point. These can trigger when you walk into a new area, and sometimes after cutscenes as well. I never minded the previous save system where if you died you went back to the bathrooms, but some people did, so I guess this is fine. In regards to the Psychopaths, there have definitely been some changes. The biggest by far is the brief invulnerability they get when attacked. Instead of standing in front of the boss, tanking their hits to damage rush them, you are forced to back off after attacking, otherwise your hits won't do any damage. This was likely implemented to put a kibosh to the damage rushing strategy, but if anything this made boss fights less enjoyable. The only thing this encourages is the strategy I didn't like already, where you attack one time, then run away to avoid their attacks. I can't stand when any enemy has this mechanic, especially bosses, but Dead Rising is a video game where your weapons will break after enough uses. This now makes you take into account the min-max of damage per hit, meaning it's best to never combo your attacks together, instead poke them for max damage, count to 3 in your head, then repeat. This makes the effort to painstakingly bring weapons like the paddle saw or Tesla balls into fights worthless. Again, I wish I could say I knew a way to improve boss fights so they're more fun, but the strengths of Dead Rising don't lend well to fast-paced action sequences. I can only say this damage dealing restriction made the boss fights much less enjoyable. I'll mention this again later, but the boss cutscenes are an area where Capcom clearly didn't want to either pay the voice actors extra, take the time to animate new scenes, or put in the effort to come up with new scenarios. It's painfully obvious that they created dialogue for Frank with the intention to change as little as possible. Economical, maybe. Ridiculous and sometimes nonsensical, yes. Ted needs to get outraged by the word slow, so of course Frank tells him to slow down.
Need to slow down and talk this over, Ted. Nice and slow.
Some of the one-liners are still present, but with different wording, signifying to me they didn't want to come up with a new way to end the scene, instead shoehorning Frank into the role of a cheesy action hero, which doesn't fit him.
You may now feed the bride.
Saying puns and bad one-liners was one of the only times Chuck ever showed personality, so I don't know why they couldn't have let him keep it. There are 2 Psychopaths in particular that are nearly completely ruined, not that they were great in the first place, by placing Frank into the exact position that Chuck was in. Slappy and the mailman. Both of them initially got angered because they recognized that Chuck had caused the outbreak. Well, obviously that isn't the case this time, so they had to come up with a new reason for these fights to start. Slappy's entire shtick is different. He's no longer a sad, pathetic boy who wanted to go out with a mascot girl, but he's a toy who wants Frank to fix his mascot girl toy? Just listen to this dialogue.
Everyone knows you! You're good at stuff! I saw it on TV!
Listen, kid, you can't believe everything you see on TV.
But I really need you to fix that toy!
You're good at stuff. I saw it on TV, but I really need you to fix that toy. As jarringly awful as that line might sound, I did include all of the context. This was the first line said by Slappy to Frank. I don't know if I need to explain why that line was so bad. You heard it. I think it speaks for itself.
You are going to help me fix my toy!
For the mailman, it's not that his lines are bad, his motivations are completely nonsensical. The reason the fight occurred last time was because he noticed he was talking to Chuck after he signed for the package. He was enraged that Chuck caused the outbreak, which tarnished his perfect delivery streak. This makes sense. In Off the Record, the same dialogue is said, "A signature is required for delivery." Then he says, "Sir, maybe you can sign for this." This package requires a signature. So he's definitely implying he needs somebody's signature, and he seems to be even acknowledging subtly that he knows Frank or Chuck isn't the correct signee, but since the signature is required, he makes a concession. Moments later, since Capcom didn't want to reshoot and animate this scene, he pulls back his hand after he reads the name. Now, the reason he wants to murder someone is because Frank isn't the addressee.
Mail fraud, sir. And mail fraud is a federal crime.
Do you see what I mean with all of this? It just seems like these were all done hastily without much thought or care given to make them feel like they fit in with Frank. For the boss fights themselves, besides the changes to how they take damage, there are some changes depending on the psychopath. The security guard now shoots whatever item you're holding out of your hands non-stop. This, coupled with the damage and vulnerability issue, makes him annoying as fuck to deal with. Slappy is a bit easier, as if you shoot his feet, he falls over. I'm fairly certain this wasn't a thing that was possible in the original. The Crazy Cure supporter now has zombies jumping out of the stalls to attack you, which fits fairly well, if albeit it does look ridiculous. It's also much brighter in the bathroom for this fight for some reason, which I don't like. They removed the flickering light effect, and they replaced the back wall with more stalls, which makes everything look homogeneous. Snowflake is easier to tame after the fight with Ted. I finally got it to work, and without much trouble either. The worst change to any boss encounter, by a huge margin, is the change to the snipers in the outdoor areas of the city. They still do 2 squares of damage, but now they seemingly never miss and shoot much more frequently. Before, you could stick close to zombies and they'd hit them instead. Well, now they hit you no matter what, and with how often they shoot, you will probably lose a lot of health in these outdoor areas. I almost got soft locked at a certain point, because I had just saved with nearly 0 health. Every time I loaded back in, they would shoot me and I'd try again. Thankfully, I had already killed one earlier, otherwise I'm not sure if I could have kept playing on that save file. When trying to complete Woodrow's side quest, it became literally impossible to continue as we both kept getting shot over and over. I actually had to abandon him entirely. There's nothing you can do to avoid damage yourself, and even less you can do to protect a survivor from taking damage. There was no possible way to save him at that point. There's also this issue. I genuinely don't think anyone at Capcom Vancouver playtested these snipers. I can't fathom anyone being okay with this garbage. They reset their animations to shoot you so quickly there's never time to react accordingly, and when a shot connects, you're knocked down, not even giving you time to run away. It's truly dog shit. Remove these guys from the game entirely. Seriously, I bet there's a mod for that, as there should be. Even though the looters aren't really a boss, it's worth mentioning their changes. They now have theme music that plays anytime they're nearby, and they seem to be much tougher to deal with, now throwing Molotov cocktails at you from far away, which can make escorting survivors a bit more of a challenge. They even use their spray paint to stun you and steal your money. You can do the same to them though, which is pretty cool. Chalk that up as another way to make money in Fortune City. There are 2 new optional boss fights. Replacing Chuck's rival on the motorcycle is Chuck himself. Pitting the 2 protagonists against each other is extremely fitting, and in a way, fairly tragic. It's clear that Chuck has lost his way, becoming deranged and delusional after the loss of his daughter. If the doll on his back wasn't proof enough, you can even see her backpack and blood splattered on the ground in the green room when the outbreak first happens. To me, this was the only time any of the Dead Rising boss fights made me reflect on who I'm fighting. Up until now, you'd be excused for not giving most of the psychopaths a second thought while you wail them into puddles of blood. They're crazy after all. Chuck is a good example of what psychopath bosses could be, however. He's not an inexplicably upset manager of a grocery store, he isn't a creepy molestation-driven random cop, and he's not a cartoonishly ridiculous mascot. Cliff from the first game, with his clear PTSD, was the only one anyone might feel pity for, but then again, he was skinning people alive. Unsympathetic is a word you could use to describe nearly every boss in the series up to this point, but for Chuck, from our time playing as him, we know there's a reason to care. Even ignoring the connection we formed by playing as him in Dead Rising 2, in this brief cutscene, we gather he's a father who just lost his daughter, and is still in the delusion that she needs the same life-saving medicine Frank uses. Not once do we see Chuck perform any evil or malicious action, but for all intents and purposes, he's a psychopath whose anger is directed at the player. It seems Capcom had a soft spot for Chuck, which is why you don't see him actually die by the end of this fight. That was probably their main concern, giving him justice through a different lens, but it just so happens that mindset helped them stumble onto something special. By pure luck, they accidentally created the best psychopath of them all, one we can sympathize with. Peter Fleming really did a superb job in this cutscene as well. I would go as far to say that this was his best work out of the two games.
The hell away from her. Ooh, crap. You're just one of those nutbards. You just want to hurt her. Keep her from getting her storm crashed. Nobody messes with my kid.
All that being said, his fight is fairly lackluster. It is better than Leon though, as Chuck does get stunned when he runs into fences and such, but he also gets caught in the fences. The first time I was only level 8 and took him down without any problems. Afterwards, however, his cutscene is great once again.
You're okay. You're safe now. That's all that matters. That's all that matters. I can't imagine what I would do if anything ever happened to you.
The other optional fight is against a somewhat familiar face once more. He's an original psychopath, but his resemblance to another from the first game is uncanny. It's like they could be brothers or something. It's a good thing they are then, isn't it? Evan, this clown on stilts, is the brother of Adam, the clown whom Frank fought and killed at the original outbreak in Willamette. One could look at this and roll their eyes at a pandering callback, but given this is basically the only time this series has outright connected two psychopaths together, it was a welcome surprise. Even if it was a bit contrived, this was probably the most visually artistic introduction so far, with the picture of Frank blowing in the wind leading to the realization from Evan. His fight is, for the most part, fairly good. He has stilts on, which means he's very high up and tough to hit. As the fight goes on, you whittle his stilts down. However, I barely noticed it thanks to the little trick the camera pulls. This is the most zoomed out and high up the camera has ever been from my recollection, so it took me a while to realize his stilts were getting shorter. His gimmick is an ice cream salesman, so he can freeze you in place with an ice cream blast. Once you do enough damage, he takes his stilts off, where it's revealed he's a dwarf, and he runs around trying to lunge at you. I don't know if I got lucky or if this phase was supposed to be easy, but I never got touched. Not a very climactic finish, however, his death cutscene is fairly enjoyable. Evan's short stature causing him to freeze himself and muttering an ice cream related line initially made me roll my eyes, but what follows sent me into a bit of hysterical laughter. I can't really explain this one, either it makes you laugh or it doesn't. With all that out of the way, let's get to the story once more. This time, instead of the introduction featuring an up-close angle of a motorcycle and a yellow jacket-clad cardboard cutout of a person, we get a stylish montage showing us the direct ramifications of the first Dead Rising game, narrated by Frank himself. It appears he got the word out about Willamette, became famous, wrote a book, had some sort of scandal, lost the TV show he was supposedly going to star in, and is seemingly at rock bottom after his 2 minutes in the limelight. So a few things here. I really don't like that the scandal is left ambiguous. I am very interested in Frank as a character and would love to know why his sudden rise concluded with a sudden fall. Another thing, he says he knew he had to uncover what was really going on. I don't know what he's referring to at all. We see him watching a Terror is Reality commercial, then he says this is his chance to get back in the game. So already this game is doing a worse job than the first Dead Rising, as I don't know what Frank's motivations are for being in the location of the next outbreak. Moving on for now, in the next cutscene some employee wants Frank's autograph, says he was bummed when Frank's show went off the air, and pointed out his autograph might be worth a lot if Frank died in the show. The only reason I bring this up is I think they should have used this guy as a psychopath, maybe a replacement for the mailman or Slappy. He has motivation, albeit a ridiculous one, to see Frank die, so it kind of writes itself. The motorcycle game show has been replaced this time around with a zombie wrestling gauntlet. This is a much better introduction to the game and its mechanics, so it's kind of strange this was used for the director's cut, where most of the players will be familiar with the controls already. While taking part in this event, we hear TK go on and on. It seems he's an asshole regardless of who he's talking to. Afterwards, the locker room scene plays out the exact same way. This time, instead of seeing the twins right away, Frank overhears something suspicious, so he goes to investigate. You find TK talking to the crazed Cure supporter, Brandon, and you take pictures of them trading a briefcase of money, and eventually the time bomb used to cause the zombie outbreak. Then 3 random goons find you and want to beat you up, so you murder them. The twins cutscene is up next, another erectile dysfunction joke.
Your performance was a little limp tonight, Frank. You must have to take pills for that at your age.
I don't know why they write garbage like this, to be honest. Outbreak happens once more. You get to the shelter. Sullivan, the bad guy, opens the bunker door for some reason yet again. This time, he knows Frank is infected, and the Zombrex conversation goes the same way. Afterwards, when Stacy's butt appears on screen, we get a shot of Sullivan's face. I didn't point this out in the previous video, but this facial expression aligns with Sullivan's character much better. Before, he had a smirk, as if to signify he knew Stacy and they were working together, or something. I don't know, it didn't make any sense. Now he's just indifferent. This is where we see Stacy for the first time, and notice her face is different. This was fairly jarring. I initially had no idea why they changed her face, but we'll get to that later. She gives Frank the earpiece communicator, and he goes off on his way to find Zombrex. Once you return with Denise, the same weird Sullivan cutscene happens once more. When the news report is on, Frank comments about Rebecca.
Look at you. Not the weather girl anymore.
Both of them being in the journalism field is a common talking point throughout the game, so it's nice to see it addressed and used to benefit their connection. Instead of the perpetrator having Chuck's uniform on, it's just Brandon out in the open planting the time bomb. Frank gets upset with Stacy. She claims Cure had nothing to do with it. Frank goes to investigate. He finds Rebecca. The same sort of cutscene plays out. Again, they didn't want to redo anything, so she pulls away from his handshake for some reason. Rebecca says real reporters don't reveal their sources, implying she thinks Frank is washed up or something. They get to the security room like usual. I want to point out here that the only reason they're able to replace Chuck with Frank so easily is Chuck was so emotionless and non-expressive in the first place, even though he was being framed. To Frank, this isn't as personal, so him mimicking Chuck's reactions looks normal. When you get back to the safe room, the same sort of scene plays out. This time Sullivan is upset at Stacy herself. Frank explains to Sullivan that he saw TK swapping money with the guy who started the outbreak. However, he never shows anyone the proof he has on his camera for whatever reason. Nothing happens for a while until you get called back by Stacy to check the monitors. Frank's reaction in this scene is really funny. Have a listen.
What's going on?
I'm pretty sure I saw somebody dragging a girl into the washroom over here.
Oh, yeah? Well, maybe if we watch these monitors for a minute. What the hell? Hey!
The crazy Cure psychopath is a required storyline boss fight this time, which I think makes much more sense, as it was already tied to the themes of the game anyway, and now this guy is involved in the plot, so it all works out. He talks about Cure as if he wasn't fully on board with it all until he saw the outbreak. Now he sees the light. This honestly makes more sense to why he thinks converting more people into zombies would be helpful. He isn't being inspired by the supposed actions of Chuck, he's continuing what he started. However, his dialogue wasn't changed enough to make sense, as he says Frank is losing the courage to do what needs to be done. That line makes no sense with Frank as the protagonist, but they make you forget that fairly quickly by having him slice the throat of his hostage this time. This surprised me quite a lot, but it didn't really make sense as it goes against everything he just said. You fight him, his death cutscene is the same, then you go back to talk to Stacy. I initially didn't like that Frank was accusing Stacy yet again, but that's my bias from the previous game carrying over. We know she's innocent, so obviously that Cure supporter was a plant from TK, not a real member. I think Frank's thought process makes sense here. You do the underground TK thing again, this time you take pictures. This is an example of where they tried to tie in the picture taking with the story like I wanted, but if you get yourself caught, it plays out the exact same way anyway. You do the train thing, TK escapes like before, you go back to talk to Stacy and Rebecca. Frank says TK is behind this. Rebecca doesn't believe him even though he has photo evidence. Her lines are of course responding to Chuck claiming he saw TK and he admitted to it, but in this scenario Frank has photo evidence! Why would she doubt him? So TK robs the bank vaults again, so you go destroy the drills. I want to point out that again, the voiceover calls from Stacy are so goddamn annoying. Every time you destroy one, she calls you, and after the last one, she calls you twice in a row.
What is it?
Frank, this is getting dangerous. There are still more of TK's goons in the city.
What did she mean it's getting dangerous? In terms of the safety of Frank West, it was dangerous the moment they started shooting assault rifles at him. I have no idea what she's talking about here. Anyway, you destroy the van. Rebecca says another sexual line when she's on top of Frank.
You need me to stick around and stay on top of the story?
The delivery for these lines are so bad. It's like a children's cartoon where they accent the most important words for emphasis. It's just so bad. I don't quite understand it, but you were supposed to meet Rebecca at the barbecue restaurant apparently. She's been captured by TK, and he won't release her until you bring him $1 million. I kind of like this, as it forces you to engage with the slot machines and security boxes if you haven't already. You have plenty of time to get the money, and cash is easier to acquire this time around anyway, so it's not so bad. Directly afterwards, Stacy calls, saying you need to get that cash to save Rebecca. Please remember this is important for later. So what the fuck? How did she know Rebecca was captured? If you don't follow through with this case and fail the story, Stacy proclaims Rebecca to be dead for some reason. I don't understand it at all. When you bring the money to the club, some dudes take it from you, and you continue to the dance floor where you're greeted once more by the twins. This is another example where they have to fit extra lines into the currently existing scene, and it just doesn't work as well.
Never look a gift horse in the mouth.
Same dialogue about the chopper, however this time there's no stakeout, you just go to the hotel rooftop right away. Frank does the same thing Chuck did with the hook cable on the helicopter, even though given how out of shape Frank is, I doubt he'd be able to do this. You bring TK back and everything goes about the same. Sullivan wants to kill TK like before, Frank stops him. This time when the military arrives, you aren't supposed to go to the safe room and watch with the others, you need to be on the roof of a random building so Frank can take pictures. I almost failed the story mode because I couldn't figure out which roof I was supposed to be on until the last second. So because you're on the roof when the military arrives, none of the scenes from the safe room are shown, so we don't know how Sullivan or Stacy reacted when they saw all of this happen. This has ramifications later on, as this scene was critical for character interactions and the pacing in general. You instead go save Rebecca immediately, do the boss fight with the sergeant, take her back to the safe room. The cutscene plays out the same way it did in the original, except because that military scene was left out, Sullivan has to tell Frank about the potential firebombing in private. Honestly, without having Stacy there to react to it, there's not really any point in bringing this up before the news report later on. The next scene is the zombie break-in once more. New survivor Tamami uses her karate to help out. However, the zombies are much stronger this time around and will most likely kill one or two of the survivors. Stacy then blames Sullivan for the break-in, saying the line about standard operating procedure that does not apply here, since what she's referring to was never said in this version of the game, so it just sounds like she's making stuff up. The military aftermath cutscene not being included means we get less screen time for Sullivan in general, so Stacy being so quick to blame him just seems out of place. TK gets bitten, Sullivan says he was knocked out cold, and TK wants Zombrax again. The news confirms that the firebombing is going to happen, and we see all of the characters react the same as last time. See what I mean about Sullivan telling Frank in private about the firebombing? It happens nearly right away anyway, so it was basically pointless. Unfortunately, this cutscene also loses context since the military safe room cutscene is absent. Specifically, Stacy saying, "Still think I'm being paranoid," isn't referring to anything anymore. Frank goes to investigate the gas, Rebecca wants him to be careful for her, implying there is a romantic interest with these two, which is fine. This is much clearer than the Stacy and Chuck romance that was never hinted at during the story. Afterwards, we see the most blatant palette swap of the main characters so far. This cutscene where Frank gives TK his Zombrax dosage really needed to be modified, but wasn't. Chuck punched him in the face because he mentioned his daughter.
Real shame she has to die.
Frank punches him in the face because he calls him a sucker?
Thanks for the meds, sucker.
Frank reacting this way just doesn't work. After this, you go to the secret tunnel area, shooty, kill the scientists. Frank comments on the coffee.
Oh, and by the way, your coffee sucks.
and we go back to the safe room with the evidence. Okay, so here comes the big reveal once more. Phenotrans. Sullivan denies it. Rebecca is about to call her news station and is shot yet again. And here we have another change I don't like. Sullivan shot her in the head last time, so I don't understand why they removed the bullet hole from her head in this scene. Oh shit, what the fuck? So if you've played this game before, me holding back this moment probably didn't matter. But if you haven't played this version of the game, I hope this surprised you as much as it did me. This was the moment the story captivated me the most, making me scream in surprise. However, for how much I love the complete subversion of my expectations, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you go back through the story. Yes, just like last time with Sullivan, Stacy's motivations and actions don't add up. They try to work around this by having her say, "Thanks for taking care of that idiot protester and backstabber TK for me," but she began helping Frank before she saw the news report that had tape showing Brandon behind all of it. Not only that, just like last time, TK doesn't discuss who he's working for, ever. It was clear TK didn't know Sullivan was in on it in the original, and it's very clear he doesn't know Stacy is behind it all this time around. She even says so in her speech later on. There's no reason she would need either of the two killed off, as whether it was TK paying a Cure supporter plant, or Cure doing it themselves, both scenarios would mean Phenotrans is in the clear. The only, and I mean only way her plan gets found out is if a news reporter and an acclaimed photojournalist start asking questions. Why would she poke and prod at this issue if that was the case? Why is she even in the safe room to begin with this time around? You could maybe make a case for Sullivan in the original game having his duty and conscience get the better of him to save some civilians, but she could literally hang out on the roof of a hotel with her guns and some orange juice and never have any of this come back to bite her. Or more realistically, she could hang out with the scientists underground and nobody would have figured this out. She told Frank where to get the Zombrex. She's been encouraging him to rescue civilians along the way for some reason. She's the one who tells him about TK underground, even though that would bring him right next to their secret hidden scientist lab. She's the one who encouraged you to destroy the drills and mess up TK's robbery efforts. She's the one who told you to rescue Rebecca, even though Rebecca being dead would significantly help her chances of not being caught, and she killed her anyway. And she encourages Rebecca and Frank when they are trying to figure out who's behind TK paying off the Cure supporter. I understand having a new antagonist with a proper amount of foreshadowing and build-up probably wasn't feasible, but it makes a lot of dialogue lines and actions from Sullivan and Stacy seem completely off base. They wanted to shock people though, and the only way to do that is to keep the story as similar as possible, so I'll give them that. It was very shocking. Playing the game once again, knowing about the twist, the constant calls from Stacy about helping Rebecca or some random survivors seems superfluous. I can't bend my suspension of disbelief to the point where I can ignore that the person who took the altruistic job of watching the monitors in case anyone needs help is the one attempting to kill everybody in the city. This is honestly worse than the Sullivan issue from the original, as she makes clear efforts to rescue and help people, but none of it was to further her goal, and all of it would have been undone by the firebombing anyway. What this needed was a few more lines of dialogue showing us how diabolical Stacy actually was. Something to the effect of, "I love how easy it was, Frank. I give you an earpiece, I tell you where to go, and you risk your life for people who are going to die anyway. I won't lie, Frank, it was pretty fun watching you play the slot machines to get money to save Rebecca. It's all the sweeter knowing I get to watch her bleed out in front of you." Or something like that. Just, for her obvious good-willed actions at the monitors, I need her to turn ultra evil for it to make sense. Not to harp on this too long, but there are a few other things that make less sense with this twist in mind. How did TK escape his handcuffs and Sullivan knocked out? Is it implied that TK actually got loose himself now? How did Stacy open up the doors to let the zombies in, and why did she do it? If her end goal was to let Frank take care of the Cure supporter and TK, the moment TK was captured was when she could have shot all of them in the face and be done with it. Oh yeah, TK isn't even taken care of since he's not dead by any means, and Stacy is aware of this fact. He's the final boss in overtime mode once again, so yeah. This twist, while shockingly great, makes every other part of the story worse. Was it worth it? I don't know, maybe. I certainly doubt Capcom figured anyone would take it this seriously though, so I'll move on. Instead of chasing the traitor to the final confrontation, we get some more fresh gameplay content. Harvesters, who are collecting queens I would assume, are scattered all over the strips of Fortune City. You have to go around destroying them, which is harder than I thought it would be since they're guarded by goons with assault rifles and sound frequency guns, and of course the zombies all around as well. This was one of the more difficult sections out of both versions of the game. Finally, we get a long monologue from Stacy. Frank pulling up a chair is a good stand-in to what the player is expecting at this moment. We all know this is the end boss fight. We all know we're going to get a monologue, attempting to tie up what we conceive as plot holes and loose ends, while putting a pretty bow on top. If you've watched professional wrestling at any point in your life, you know how vital the promo is to properly entice the audience to give a shit, but following a paint-by-number formula so strictly can sometimes be seen as a negative. I think Frank calling attention to how ridiculously obvious and nearly contrived it all is quite funny, but not really in line with Frank as a character, at least if the first Dead Rising game is anything to go by. This is something I'd expect from a character like Deadpool, playing on the meta aspect of it all. Stacy says TK was paid well for giving them access to the cages, and that Cure has always been a nice tool for them to exploit. Just pointing out again that this means they were intending Cure to take the fall, so taking out Brandon really wouldn't have been a concern. I also don't understand why Phenotrans thinks it's a good idea for their plant in the Cure protest group to be the voice of the group and its goals. I'm assuming since she had a wig on, she was pretending to be someone named Stacy Forsythe, and was going to make it look like she had died in the firebombing. But was Stacy Forsythe the real person, or was she just made up? I don't know. I don't get it. Is that why her face is different? Is this not actually Stacy Forsythe? Does it matter? I don't know. Anyway, enough of all that. We have a new Psychopath boss fight. It's a giant robot thing. It looks to be a modified version of one of those rides that you could visit in the Uranus zone. Since there are 3 health bars, there are 3 not-so-distinct phases of the fight to go along with them. In the first phase, it smashes the ground. Second phase, it uses its pincers and a claw attack. Both of these require you to attack its weak spots on the sides of the claw. After these 2, the arms are broken, and you shoot the missiles back at the robot. Then you perform some quick-time events to damage Stacy herself. In the death cutscene, ludonarrative dissonance is on full display as she gets the upper hand inexplicably. The scene ends just like you'd expect, where the villain gets defeated through random chance. Boy, that was satisfying. Frank calls Channel 6 Action News, and we proceed to the end of the main story. Instead of Katie and Stacy to go back for, Frank goes back to get TK instead of escaping with the helicopter. What he finds is Rebecca's name tag on the ground and her body gone. After the fake credits, overtime mode happens exactly like before, only now TK has captured a still very much alive Rebecca, which is a surprise to Frank. The fetch quest around Fortune City takes place, but is enhanced greatly by added voice lines this time around, describing the items you're collecting. This is the kind of improvement that has no downsides, just a logical fill to a gap that shouldn't have existed in the original. What follows is a satisfying return to the zombie killing challenge we started the game with, giving the impression that we've come full circle. It is unfortunate that if you die in this next part fighting TK, you will need to redo this section, but aside from that, this really seems in line with not only TK as a person for forcing Frank into this psychotic torture game show one last time for his sole amusement, but the game as a whole for rounding out the experience. It makes me curious if Capcom Vancouver were kicking themselves for not trying this sort of thing with Chuck the first time around. Successfully survive through a few waves of zombies, and Rebecca throws down a rope for you to climb up on. The same fight happens again. Instead of cranking a handle to raise Stacy and Katie, you tend to Rebecca's wounds via button mashing. I had a harder time this go around with the boss fight simply because I was a lower level. It's interesting how Dead Rising rewards players for being better at the game and seeing the proper ending the first go around. I say rewards, but when banging my head against the wall trying to work with the new damage dealing restriction, it did feel like the developers were treating my first save file success as if I had played the game wrong. Because this isn't a dedicated action game that provides adequate room for mastery of mechanics, attack patterns, and spacing, no matter how good at the game you are, how smoothly this fight goes is largely dictated on your level. There's a finite amount of resources in this stage, meaning you can't possibly heal every tick of damage you take forever, and since there's nearly nothing you can do when you see an attack coming your way, this fight can feel incredibly cheap if you've managed to see the overtime ending at a lower level than perhaps the developers expected. There's also another interesting way to look at this sequence. This, besides maybe the introduction of both iterations of Dead Rising 2, is the only time you don't get to decide how you're going to deal damage to the boss. It might sound obvious, but think about it for a second. In every boss fight, there are thousands of possible item slot combinations you could be going in with. Balancing might not seem like such a high priority given that fact, as you could very well blame the player for not taking the time to craft a laser sword and some juice buffs, instead of only bringing in a lead pipe and Cheetos. With TK, the only variation that needs to be taken into account is the player's level. One that I don't think was actually taken into account, if I haven't made that clear, but we'll move past that. This means that the item placements in this level were probably carefully thought over many times through, resulting in what we have now. Spotlights, orange juice, dynamite, and cardboard boxes that could contain a snack or a can of paint. This emphasizes the idea that the level of your character really is the most important part of this equation, as you might end up relying on somersault kicks to win you the day. I know I didn't analyze this fight as much in the previous video, but I would say I came away with a positive impression the first go around. I wouldn't say I've necessarily reversed my thinking on it, as it is nice to strip the player of what they've come to expect out of the game, which is of course the comfort of knowing you went into a boss fight prepared, but I can see its disadvantages much clearer trying it at a lower level, with the addition of the damage dealing restriction in place. I don't think there is any one perfect finale sequence or boss fight which could cap off what Dead Rising is, but this two-part structure of defeating hordes of zombies in ridiculous fashion, going straight into a hunt for resources while managing an incredibly fast boss, is as close as we're going to get. Afterwards, the romance angle makes much more sense given the obvious sexual tension on display throughout. I feel the need to preface my next point, so be prepared for some hyperbole. What follows is quite possibly the greatest end credit song to cap off Dead Rising 2 off the record. The composer of the game, Alexa Lazauchuk, said his intention with the mall music was to create something inspiring and forgettable. A complete failing on his part, as this is one of the most unforgettable tracks I've heard. These credits hit me on an emotional level more than I think the developers would have ever imagined. After all, I was pretty critical of Off the Record in this video, and the same could be said for my thoughts in the original Dead Rising 2 critique. Alas, I have a bit of a confession to make. I was playing Dead Rising 3 frequently while I was working on this video. I don't want to dwell on it too much right now, but it's safe to say that my impression of the game is far from positive. Even though I initially framed it as a slight criticism, Dead Rising 2 sticking so closely to the original staved off whatever the fuck Dead Rising 3 is. I generally try to avoid comparing newer entries in a series to previous ones, but playing Dead Rising 3 a bit too soon gave me some perspective, a serendipitous moment if you will. It allowed me to appreciate how incredible these past 3 Dead Rising games are. It's frustratingly hard to point to X and Y and say those are the reasons these games are so unique and worth playing, but I hope I've been able to at least somewhat describe the many ways they truly shine. Of course they have their problems, but what game doesn't? What started out as me playing a director's cut of a great game instead turned into a celebration, a finale, a fond farewell to what it means to be a Dead Rising game. Regardless of how the next videos on this series turn out, if I end up coming around to the newer games after all, or I instead fill your ears with pessimistic complaints and cynicism, nothing can take away from what Dead Rising 1, Dead Rising 2, and Dead Rising 2 Off the Record truly are. Fantastic.